In this clip, I want to explain to you more about this process Darwin called descent with modification, but now in biology we call it natural selection. And I want to go back a couple of slides here. Yes, to this illustration, you can see Charles Darwin, and probably in one of those moments when he was thinking, pondering about how life changes over time. Descent with modification relies heavily on the concept of an adaptation. And I want to tell you that an adaptation is a characteristic that, number one, it must be heritable, meaning that it is based in the DNA of an organism, meaning also that generation can pass that characteristic, parents can pass that characteristic over to their descendants, to the offspring. Number two, that characteristic, which is heritable, must also provide two advantages. Number one, there has to be an advantage in terms of reproducing. That characteristic will be something that makes it easier for the organism to acquire resources like shelter, maybe food, maybe even something like mates. And so that leads to the third benefit of this, the third characteristic of an adaptation, which is going to be, it must provide the advantage of increasing reproductive success. In other words, organisms with adaptations are going to be those that most likely produce a greater number of offspring, of descendants. So think about adaptations again. And I've told you three conditions. Number one, this is a characteristic that must be inherited. Number two, it has to be a characteristic that provides an advantage with survival. And number three, a characteristic that provides an advantage when it comes to reproducing and producing offspring, the next generation. So Darwin viewed these characteristics as those that will be beneficial for parents to pass to the next generation. And this is the birth of the idea of descent with modification. Those modifications would be precisely these adaptations we are talking about. Darwin never really used the word evolution in the book he wrote on on the origin of species by natural selection. And this concept of descent with modification is something that he used to explain, for example, how a place where we had seen certain kinds of plants and animals in South America would be the process of descent with modification will be responsible for those things he saw later on an island in the Galapagos, like a plant or an animal that resembled, it looked similar to the ones we had seen before in mainline, but now they had some characteristics that were different. They were slightly different. And so how did this descent with modification work? People have taken the time to summarize Darwin's main ideas on this book of the origin of species through natural selection. And a famous geneticist named Ernst Mayr came up with this summary called Modern Synthesis. And he summarized basically the entire process of descent with modification into a set of 3 observations and 2 conclusions. In your textbook, you can find 2 observations, 2 inferences, or conclusions. So it really doesn't matter how many inferences or conclusions there are. Let's just consider what exactly is at stake in natural selection. Number 1, Darwin said, hey, not all of the plants that germinate from the seeds produced by a parent plant, not all of the offspring produced by the parents in a population of animals will survive or reproduce. He was looking at natural scenarios where disease or predation or herbivory will be responsible for eliminating often those organisms that are really young. Consequently, many organisms never develop into the stage we call the adult stage of life. That means that they will never be able to reproduce. So this type of phenomenon where most organisms actually end up dying before they can reproduce is something that he thought, okay, there has to be a reason for that. Another observation that Darwin noted was that there was a limitation in the resources organisms need. For a plant, a resource would be water, soil, space. And if you go to a meadow, if you go to a forest, you will see that often there is strong competition by plants to access the water, to access the sunlight, to have a place to grow. The same thing happens with animals. There's not going to be enough food or enough water or enough shelter to make life comfortable for all of the animals that live in a population, especially when there is over reproduction. And that is a tendency that Darwin addressed, this tendency of life to produce, to overpopulate, to over-reproduce, as it is described in your textbook. Look, over-reproduction is not a good thing because it will lead to use of the resources or depletion of the resources getting all used up, and intensifying the competition that will follow. And so that brings us to our first conclusion. A struggle for survival is guaranteed to happen every time the resources a population of organisms needs gets used up, or those resources dwindle down to a point where not very much of that resource like water or food or shelter is left for the members of the population. Since we have a struggle here, now the next question is, who is going to win? Who is going to be the one that survives this intense competition? And for that, we can bring another observation. Darwin had noticed that on any population of plants or animals, you name it, insects or rodents or birds or any other type of mammal, there is a great deal of variation, just like you find in human populations. Look at the people in a class. I mean, right now you are, probably sitting in classrooms where there's a lot of students, and it is easy once you know the name of a student to recognize them, because a person with a certain name has characteristics that are different from everyone else in class. Maybe different hair, maybe different hair color, maybe the color of the skin is going to be different, the shape of a person's eyes, the shape and size of the nose, the ears. All of those are characteristics that makes us all unique and different. Darwin said, well, the same thing happens on any population of living things. There are going to be a lot of variations that will be, in some cases, beneficial, and in some cases are not going to be beneficial. Let us focus on those we have already addressed, we call adaptations. Characteristics that are going to be useful for survival and for reproduction. And so now I'm going to switch to my laser pointer again. So look on this observation number 3, and you'll find those 3 key characteristics of an adaptation. They have to be heritable, meaning that parents must be able to pass those traits to the offspring, to the next generation. They must provide an advantage when it comes to survival. As I said, this advantage may be in making it easier to get food, maybe making it easier to find and defend a shelter, or maybe making it easier to get water, some other resource that is necessary for survival. And number 3, the third characteristic is that these adaptations will be producing an advantage when it comes to reproduction, when it comes to finding mates, fighting for mates, attracting a mate, being selected by a member of the opposite sex for the purpose of sexual reproduction. And so that is what is implied here in this third observation. What is the last conclusion we can draw from this? Is that there is going to be differential reproduction. And here I want you to pay attention to these 2 words. Differential reproduction. This is going to be synonymous to what we also call natural selection. So these 2 concepts are synonymous: natural selection and differential reproduction. What is exactly the meaning of differential reproduction? It means that in a population, there are going to be some organisms that produce large numbers of offspring, those that are really successful at finding mates and producing members for the next generation. In the same population, there's going to be some that produce fewer numbers of offspring. Maybe reproduce once in a lifetime, they only have a couple of descendants, and in that same population, there's going to be those that produce zero offspring. Absolutely no descendants left by those organisms. And so that's what we mean by differential reproduction. There are going to be differences in the degree of success organisms have when it comes down to reproduction. What do I mean? Here goes one more time. On any population, some individuals will produce large numbers of offspring, some will produce lower numbers of offspring, and some will produce no offspring whatsoever. Perhaps it is easier to explain this whole process of how natural selection works if we look at a real example from nature. And so here's an animal that may be familiar to you if you visit the Puget Sound, if you go around Alki Point. There are times when you can see sea lions. Well, they look furry and they look cute and everything and adorable, but there's a time in the year, especially in March, when mating happens. And so before males can get access to females, they have to go through a process of fighting what we call intrasexual competition among members of the same sex. And here you see, for example, two males going at it. So, but let's go back and review the observations and the inferences we had from before. Number one, we said not all of the individuals born in a population will survive or reproduce. You were looking at a scene from the beach. We can see all the different pups. Some of them are resting, some of them are sleeping, presumably close to or next to their mothers. What would happen is that as the months continue and they go back to live in the ocean, some are going to be eaten by maybe orcas, some are going to be subject to diseases, some are going to maybe not get enough food and they're simply going to die. It is sad, and yet it is a reality for most of the organisms we see out there. So not all of these babies born on a given year will survive to a reproductive age. Observation number two, there's going to be limited resources. For these animals, for the sea lions, there's going to be competition for places to breed. That's a resource that they are needing for producing the next generation. There's going to be competition for the fish in the ocean. There's going to be all sorts of resources that are going to be limited at any point in their life. What is next? First conclusion. There is going to be a struggle for survival. And in that struggle for survival is going to be those individuals that have the best adaptations. Observation number three, the best adaptations, those characteristics that are heritable and increase the chances of surviving and reproducing. And so for these male sea lions you see right here, an advantage is having a larger body size. It is easy to tell when you look at a population of sea lions which ones are the males and which ones are the females, because the males can easily be 3-4 times the size of a female if you were to weigh them, if you were to look at the mass. Size-wise, looks like the females are about half the size, but weight-wise, males are considerably heavier and larger than the females. And so why is that an advantage? Well, it takes a bigger body to be able to fight an opponent and take possession of the beach. Why is taking care of this area an advantage for sea lions? When the females come later to give birth to the pups, and about 2 or 3 days after they give birth, they become receptive again, and that's when the males can mate with them. Only those males that have secured a portion of the beach will be guaranteed access to the females and will have the ability to produce members of the next generation. And that leads to the second conclusion. The second conclusion is that there is going to be differential reproduction. For these males that are highly successful, they have the big body size, which is an adaptation, which have higher levels of aggression, another adaptation. For those males that have all of those characteristics, they will be able to produce greater numbers of offspring. We really don't know exactly what happened in this contest, but what if this was the male that lost? Let's say that this male, after the battle, was too exhausted and just didn't have energies, and it didn't have a section of the beach to get females to mate. Maybe you'll have a chance to mate the next year or the next one. We don't know. Maybe it only produces a few offspring, or perhaps never has a chance to mate. So the second conclusion we have here, meaning that There's differential reproduction. Some organisms produce fewer or no offspring, will be what can be expected for most of the members of a population. Really, there's only a few successful ones, the ones that pass the genes to the next generation. And so what would happen, I'm just concluding now, with regards to differential reproduction, what happens over time is that the characteristics that make an organism successful and produce more offspring are the ones that are spread towards among the members of the next generation. And so those characteristics are the ones that are preserved and lead to the change in how a species looks over time. The frequency of adaptations in a population will increase over time. And that is how natural selection works.